Pinocchio is often regarded by animation fans as one of the greatest Disney films of all time, but I feel that in mainstream pop culture, it's mostly remembered for its scariest moments, which make up most of the film's second half. The movie is a work of art, with some of the most detailed backgrounds ever seen in an animated film. It has pretty well-developed characters and a lush orchestral score, but at the end of the day, I suppose it really is the childhood trauma that wins out in most of our memories. I don't think I really appreciated Pinocchio as a movie until I was nearly out of high school myself. Still, these scary moments are very appropriate for a villain's retrospective. Pinocchio features a large group of villains, but before we talk about them, we should take a quick look at the original book. Pinocchio is generally seen as a fairy tale in the same vein as the Brothers Grimm stories, but it is actually a more recent work, relatively speaking, of course. Written by Carlo Collodi, it was first published as a serial in an Italian children's magazine in 1881, where its translated title was The Story of a Puppet. In the story, a magical piece of wood is carved into a marionette that comes to life and quickly begins making a nuisance of himself. Pinocchio the puppet torments his carver, Geppetto, and when a talking cricket lectures him, Pinocchio throws a hammer at the bug, killing it. After a few misadventures, Pinocchio is killed by a ruthless fox and cat. He was given the gift of life and squandered it, so he deserved to die, the story essentially says. The end. At least that was meant to be the end, but the story had proved to be quite successful, and Collodi's publisher urged him to write more chapters. Thus, Pinocchio was revived and the story became slightly more positive. I say slightly because although there was a happy ending and more emphasis put on Pinocchio working to gain humanity and earn the form of a real boy, there were still some incredibly traumatic moments in the text. With that context in mind, we'll start our villainous rundown with the liars that Pinocchio practically meets right out the door. In the original story, they were simply an unnamed fox and cat. The two pretend to be disabled beggars, the fox feigning a limp and the cat faking blindness. When they meet Pinocchio, the wooden boy has come into possession of 5 gold coins, we'll discuss the circumstances of that when we talk about Stromboli, and the greedy animals are quick to con him. They tell Pinocchio that they will show him an enchanted field where he can plant the coins to make a money tree. It is painfully obvious that they are not to be trusted. But being a foolish child who shirks basic education, Pinocchio is happy to follow them to get rich quick. The fox and cat tell Pinocchio to meet them at a wooded area at midnight. When Pinocchio goes to meet them, they appear disguised as robbers in black cloaks and hang the puppet from a tree, which was meant to be his death as stated earlier. A little later, after being revived, Pinocchio encounters the animals again, where they take him to the phony Field of Miracles and have him bury the money. Of course, they make off of it when Pinocchio isn't looking. They aren't seen again until near the end of the story, where they really have become disabled and impoverished as a result. They beg Pinocchio for help, and he all but laughs in their faces before continuing on his journey. In the Disney film, while the fox calls himself Honest John, his real name is stated to be J. Worthington Foulfellow, although it's never actually used in the movie proper. The cat is named Gideon. Foulfellow was voiced by Walter Catlett, and Gideon was voiced by Mel Blanc. You might be saying, wait, Gideon didn't talk in the movie, and you're right. He had dialogue written for him, and Mel Blanc was set to record his lines, but in the end it was decided the cat would be funnier if he was a mute Harpo Marx type, similar to what happened with Dopey the Dwarf a few years prior. Blanc recorded a few hiccups for Gideon, but that ended up being the extent of his voice work for the movie. Most of his very long voice acting career was done for Warner Brothers and Hanna-Barbera, with his only other Disney roles being some of the Looney Tunes characters in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Cousin Orville and a Parrot in The Carousel of Progress. Foulfellow and Gideon were essentially written to be a vaudeville duo. Out of all the villains in the movie, they come across as the most likable because the scenes with them are incredibly funny. Although we really only see them pull the wool over Pinocchio's eyes, which is a pretty easy feat, one can imagine they've been able to swindle others in the past because of Foulfellow's charm and Gideon's endearing bumbling. Of course, that's the whole point. Looks are deceiving, and Pinocchio was literally born yesterday. He believes everything they tell him without question. He is such a perfect patsy that they are able to trick him twice without much effort. Of course, they really are terrible people underneath their friendliness and dopiness. Gideon's first instinct to catch Pinocchio is to pull out his mallet, and he later tries to smash Jiminy Cricket with it. In the scene where the coachman offers them a large payment for a special job, Foulfellow immediately assumes they're supposed to kill someone, and shows no hesitation in his willingness to murder. He seems taken aback when he's told Pleasure Island is involved, but only because he fears the police, not for any moral reasons. When it comes to selling children into slavery, they're your go-to guys. And yet, like I said, it's hard not to like them. According to the unauthorized book Mouse Under Glass by David Coig, there was going to be a scene after Pinocchio and Jiminy escape Pleasure Island where they run into the fox and cat one more time. When the bad guys pursue Pinocchio, they run into the police instead and are finally arrested. This was cut for pacing reasons, so, like most of the other villains in the movie, they get away with their misdeeds and make a sizable profit as well. For a movie about magic and talking animals, Pinocchio feels very real in this sense. As you'll see with the other baddies on the list, the film teaches a harsh lesson. Sometimes the evil people in the world do get away with their crimes. It doesn't mean you should stop being a good person. If anything, it means you should find the strength to be good in spite of this. Now I'll get off my little soapbox here, and we'll talk about the other times the fox and cat have shown up in Disney media. Foulfellow and Gideon have probably made the most other appearances out of the Pinocchio villains. Granted, one of the earliest times they're going to be reused didn't actually get made. The Mickey and the Beanstalk feature, which eventually was shortened and used as the second half of Fun and Fancy Free, was going to have a scene where the fox and cat trade Mickey Mouse's cow for the magic beans. Well, I'd love to have seen them interact with Disney's biggest star. The scene was changed, so it was Queen Minnie Mouse who did the trade. And then the scene wound up getting cut anyway. Oh well. Geppetto's cat Figaro proved to be popular enough to have a few shorts made about him, now as Minnie's cat. One cartoon called Bath Day had an alley cat resembling Gideon show up near the end. Given the fact that Figaro is the star of the cartoon, the Pinocchio connection was probably intentional. While Gideon is actually pretty cute as a fully clothed anthro character, he makes a rather ugly conventional cat. In an audio adaptation of A Christmas Carol released in 1974, the two of them played the collectors for the poor, who Ebenezer Scrooge chases away. Given their less than trustworthy nature in Pinocchio, it makes sense that when the adaptation was animated as Mickey's Christmas Carol in 1983, they were changed to Ratty and Mole from The Wind in the Willows. In 1975, a book was published with the duo in a more fitting role. Foulfellow and Gideon acted as the tailors in an adaptation of The Emperor's New Clothes, who more or less gaslight an entire kingdom with supposedly invisible clothes that don't really exist. The cherry on top was that the Emperor in the story was played by Prince John from Robin Hood. In the wide world of Disney Comics, Foulfellow and Gideon have made a decent amount of appearances, at least more than the other villains in this video. Perhaps because they are the least threatening of the ensemble, they can be more easily applied to a simple 12-page comic as antagonists. In most of the stories, they are up to their usual tricks. Unlike the movie, they rarely get away with their misdeeds in the funny pages, which is admittedly pretty satisfying to see. A video game based on the movie came out in 1996 for the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and the Game Boy. I'm not sure why they bothered to release a game on that date since it didn't coincide with any theatrical or video re-release. Maybe it was because a different Pinocchio movie came out that year despite not being a Disney film? Who knows? Foulfellow only appears on the first level spying on Pinocchio, who you of course play as he heads to school. At the end of the level, the fox is waiting to lead you astray. Gideon actively hinders your progress meanwhile by running around and throwing flower pots at you. Later, Gideon makes a completely random appearance in an underwater level. Go figure. Rather surprisingly, they were never featured in a Kingdom Hearts game, although they were initially planned to be seen in Kingdom Hearts 358 Over 2 Days. I really hate saying that title out loud. The two can be seen at the Disney theme parks, sometimes as meetable characters and sometimes in parades. Out of all the Pinocchio villains, they are the most common, again because they're the least threatening and arguably the most huggable. In the Pinocchio's Daring Journey Dark Ride, they can be seen hanging out on Pleasure Island. Given their knowledge of how dangerous the island actually is, their inclusion in that scene is a little strange, but the Imagineers probably didn't know where else to stick them. Moving on from those scoundrels, we have a much more intimidating villain in Stromboli. I'm sure a lot of us were scared by this guy as kids, but his book counterpart is comparatively decent actually. In The Adventures of Pinocchio, the character is called Mangiafuoco. To my Italian viewers, I am so sorry if I butchered that pronunciation. I'll just refer to him by his translated name, the Fire Eater. He is the puppet master at the local marionette theater, where Pinocchio goes on his own accord instead of going to school. In fact, he meets the Fire Eater before he meets the fox and the cat. At the show, the puppets on stage recognize Pinocchio as one of their own, even knowing his name. They stop performing and invite the wooden boy on stage to celebrate, completely abandoning the show. Of course, the audience is not happy, and the Fire Eater decides to punish Pinocchio by using him for firewood. The puppets drag Pinocchio toward the fire while he pleads for his life. Seeing how pitiful and frightened he is, the Fire Eater feels compassionate. He quickly overcomes his anger and decides to let Pinocchio go, along with some gold coins, which are what attract the fox and cat to the plot. While the Fire Eater's harsh demeanor hides a sensitive individual, the Disney version of the character, Stromboli, is harsh through and through. While he pretends to be nice to Pinocchio, even most children watching the movie for the first time will probably be able to see through his act. Stromboli cannot keep up his pleasant facade for very long, and is very quick to let the mask slip. His booming voice was supplied by Charles Judels. Stromboli revealing his true colors is the turning point of the movie. The first half has been very light and fun. Foulfellow and Gideon have proven to be very funny and likable, but Stromboli is cruel with no redeeming aspects. He sees Pinocchio as nothing but another puppet, albeit a very bankable one, in spite of his sentience. He makes it clear that Pinocchio will perform till he drops, at which case he's firewood. Pinocchio's signature song being about how much he enjoys his freedom just adds to the cruel irony of the situation. Not to mention, although Pinocchio is able to escape this fate with the help of the Blue Fairy, Stromboli is another villain in the movie who does essentially manage to get away with his misdeeds. Yes, he loses his star attraction as soon as he finds him, but he still made a pretty hefty profit off the puppet. On the off chance he finds another living puppet on his travels, there is no doubt he'd do it all again in a heartbeat. I will admit though that I was wrong when I said that Stromboli had no redeeming features. In spite of his cruelty, he does put on a hell of a puppet show. We never see his crew directly, although there is concept art of his orchestra, but they're a hard-working bunch. There are at least 2 talented puppeteers controlling the marionettes, and his orchestra plays some well-arranged music. The fact that they can all fit into 2 small wagons is equally impressive. Of course, this made more sense in the earlier version of the script when Stromboli was going to be based in a puppet theater in the village. Making him a traveling performer added a sense of urgency to Pinocchio's situation, since the longer it took Jiminy to help him with the lock on the cage, the harder it would be to get back home. In a nice case of creative recycling, the unused design for the puppet theater was utilized as the exterior for the Pinocchio dark ride at the theme parks over 40 years later. With the praise I've given to Stromboli's theater troupe, I do have to wonder how he treats/pays them. Pinocchio is not seen as a legitimate human being, but I get the feeling that Stromboli's not much nicer to his crew either. Stromboli did not appear as frequently in the comics as Foulfellow and Gideon, but he did show up from time to time, usually acting in his natural, cruel fashion as an exploitative slave driver of his performers. In addition to his puppets, he was seen as the owner of a flea circus, and even once tried to steal Pluto to use him as an attraction. Stromboli appears once in the Pinocchio's Daring Journey ride, where he's voiced by Ray Templin. He's seen backstage as theater looming over the riders. Pinocchio dangles in a cage nearby. A costumed version of Stromboli has been seen from time to time. He was featured in the Disney On Parade touring show in the 70s. It was essentially Disney on Ice without the on ice part. In this appearance, he was voiced by Thurl Ravenscroft. The character does appear at the theme parks, although he's not as common a sight as the other Pinocchio characters. If you ever spot him in your travels, be sure to take some pictures. A very different version of Stromboli was featured in the made-for-TV musical Geppetto in 2000. Here, he's performed by Brent Spiner, who is the main villain and pursues Pinocchio throughout the story, unlike the animated version. This Stromboli is a washed-up performer, although I use the phrase washed up lightly. It's quite possible he was never really that good in the first place. When Pinocchio escapes Stromboli, he immediately hops on the coach to Pleasure Island. Stromboli sets out to get him back. He is swiftly removed from Pleasure Island, however, and instead waits for Geppetto and Pinocchio to return home from their adventures. He tries to reclaim Pinocchio, citing his legally binding contract the puppet signed. Geppetto pleads for Stromboli to reconsider in a scene that genuinely does tug at the heartstrings in spite of the rather cheesy movie. Stephen Schwartz's music is largely to thank for this. In the end, Geppetto's love for his son is what prompts the Blue Fairy to change Pinocchio into a real boy, thus making him worthless to Stromboli, but not to his father. This Stromboli might be the least threatening version of the character in any adaptation of the story, even the VeggieTales one. But that doesn't mean he's bad. Spiner is clearly having a lot of fun, and he plays into the character's neurotic and slightly crazy persona very well. He has no actual friends or family and instead talks to his puppets like they're real people. People he often does not get along with. It's a different but entertaining take on the character. Before we move on, I will add just 2 interesting bits of trivia I couldn't properly work in beforehand. Trivia 1, concept art shows that Stromboli was going to have a parrot at some point before the bird was dropped. I'm guessing they couldn't really find a way to give the parrot a real purpose. The other trivia is that in an interview with artist Yoshi Katobi, I do not know if I pronounced that right, who worked for Nintendo, it was revealed that part of the design of Wario was inspired by Stromboli. Who knew? We have now reached the most sinister Pinocchio character both in the Disney version and the original story. While there are plenty of disturbing and scary scenes in the adventures of Pinocchio, the donkey transformation and everything related to that part usually stands out as the scariest moment to many. In the book, there exists a secret world known as the Land of Toys, where little boys are encouraged to be as lazy and indulge in as much G-rated hedonism as possible. Of course, these situations always have a catch, and after several months of living it up, the boys are transformed into donkeys and sold. The only adult seen in this mysterious land is identified as the little man, who drives the boys there in his coach, and shows up to collect them as donkeys later on. He is initially described as being quite pleasant, and an instant friend to all the children, but his true colors are shown almost instantly. When the donkeys driving the coach refuse to cooperate, undoubtedly as past victims, the little man bites off part of their ears. Despite witnessing this, no red flags or warning bells go off for Pinocchio or any of the boys. The last we hear of the little man is that he's become a millionaire from the donkey trade in the span of only a few years. The little man was renamed the Coachman in the Disney film, although his name/title is never said on screen. The Land of Toys was renamed Pleasure Island. The Coachman was voiced by Stromboli's actor, Charles Joodles. There's no twist in his true nature here. It's made apparent in his first scene where he offers Foulfellow and Gideon the chance to make some extra cash finding boys for him. His twisted, inhuman grin when he assures the fox and cat that there'll be no squealers is one that few will ever forget. Of course, for his victims in the movie, he is able to keep up the friendly facade better than Stromboli. Jiminy Cricket can sense that there's something very unkosher going on at Pleasure Island, but he doesn't find any definitive proof until around the same time as the other boys, at which point it's too late for most of them. Just like in the book, the boys transform into donkeys, gathered by the coachman's ghastly, gorilla-looking henchmen, and sold. The scenes involving the donkeys are quite possibly some of the most horrifying moments in any animated family film. It's never stated how long the kids have to be on Pleasure Island to transform, but I get the feeling it was a lot shorter than 5 months like in the book. While the coachman presumably makes some decent money off the donkeys, it's been suggested that the cash is only an added perk to what he does. After all, Pleasure Island is a pretty huge structure with carnival rides, a boatload of cigars, an entire mansion to demolish complete with the Mona Lisa, and probably more locations that we don't even get to see. There is a lot of concept art of the Pleasure Island sequences that went unused. Just selling donkeys would not be enough to sustain such a venture. Based on the face he flashes Foulfellow, his monster henchmen, and the island's magic abilities, I think we can safely assume that the coachman is not human. His driving motivation seems to be to lead wayward souls astray and then punish them. It's a small thing to note, but when he's giving Foulfellow instructions, he mentions meeting at the crossroads and departing at midnight. In folklore, one would go to the crossroads at midnight to meet the devil and make some sort of bargain, one that rarely went in the person's favor. Just throwing that out there. There's a lot that they never explain about Pleasure Island, and I like that. A writer doesn't need to scrutinize every single detail about a story's magical world. It often takes away from the mystery and wonder surrounding it. The less we truly know about Pleasure Island is probably for the better, and will better fuel everyone's imaginations. Who built it? Is the island itself magic, or does laziness turn people into donkeys elsewhere in this universe? Is there a separate Pleasure Island for little girls, or for adults? Foulfellow seems to be aware of the island's reputation to some extent, and even mentions the law finding out, which implies that other people know about the island, so is anyone else trying to find it and destroy it? The potential for fan theories is wonderful. What surprises me the most about the Coachman is that when Pinocchio came out, the Hays Code was in full effect. This was a series of moral guidelines that basically dictated what Hollywood films could and could not show, and was heavily enforced from 1934 to around 1968. One of the big no-nos was letting the villains get away with their misdeeds. They had to push the crime never pays moral. All the villains we've discussed so far get away with making some nice cash from mistreating Pinocchio, but the Coachman is definitely the most evil of the lot, since he's still out there hurting countless children. How this slipped by the censors, I'll never know. The only time I've ever seen him get any kind of comeuppance was in the Pinocchio video game, where you're able to fight him and his henchmen. When you attack the henchies, they disappear in a magical puff of smoke, and you ultimately get to knock the Coachman off a cliff. Knowing him, it probably didn't defeat him for long, but it's nice to see. Kingdom Hearts 3D Dream Drop Distance had a Pleasure Island-inspired area called Prankster's Paradise, but the Coachman was oddly not included. That's a shame. His minions already look like Heartless. I wonder if it was a time-saving thing for the programmers or something. I really can't imagine why they left him out. The Coachman appeared in Disney Comics the least out of the Pinocchio villains. I could only find a few appearances, and most of them aren't in English. Maybe the writers thought he was too scary. Similarly, there is a walk-around costume version of the Coachman, but I've only found a single image of it used in the Disney on Parade show. I haven't found any accounts of him appearing at the theme parks in person. However, while Foulfellow, Gideon, and Stromboli all appear only once in Pinocchio's daring journey, the Coachman gets the distinction of appearing twice. First, he is seen watching Pinocchio and Lampwick transform, and after the guests pass through a room full of crying donkeys, one of the most upsetting sections of a Disney ride, he tries to corral the guests into a crate for the salt mines. In the attraction, he was voiced by Ray Templin, who also voiced Stromboli. Kinda neat how in both the movie and the ride these characters shared a voice actor. Walt Disney World has a nighttime area called Pleasure Island aimed at adults, but it's a completely different area than the film, only sharing the name. At least I'm pretty sure it is. If you're out partying and you notice there are more donkeys than people on the dance floor, I'd leave if I were you. In the Geppetto movie, the Coachman is called the Ringmaster, and he's played by Usher. He and his men get a very catchy song about the joys of Pleasure Island, which often gets stuck in my head. Here, the transformation seems to be specifically linked to a roller coaster building. Now, the final hurdle Pinocchio faces on his adventures is Monstro the Whale. I had planned to say a lot about him, but after thinking it over, I eventually came to the conclusion that I don't think of him as a true villain. Hear me out. What exactly does Monstro do that's evil or villainous? He eats a ton of fish, but he's the biggest thing in the ocean next to the Kraken, so he needs to eat a lot. Aside from a nasty smirk he makes before he gulps down a school of tuna, Monstro shows no malice toward the fish, it's just nature. Yes, he chases Pinocchio and Geppetto down at the end with the intention to either eat them again or kill them, but Monstro seems to display significantly less intelligence than the other characters, acting more like an actual animal. If you provoke an animal, it will retaliate. At the end of the day, I view Monstro as more of a force of nature than a villain. He is a great final obstacle for Pinocchio to overcome, but he's just not an actual villain to me. It's rather sad that he's the only of the antagonists to get any sort of comeuppance in the movie. I don't know if crashing against those rocks killed him, but it had to hurt. Not to mention the aforementioned, fire in his stomach. There is definitely going to be some gray area about who or what I consider a villain as we go on in this retrospective. Our next episode, however, will feature one of the biggest embodiments of evil, the devil himself, or at least the Disney version. Join me then for a night on Bald Mountain with the villains of Fantasia.